The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I am Tylor, and I am joined, as always, by Greg, who I think gets more and more excited about how much he knows about the Wheel of Time, including, I will say, I have been waiting for months to tell you, you wrote our intro script and used the word novice like 3 times in it, and now for the first time in this book, I can tell you that was a wonderful choice of words that I'm glad I didn't have to edit. Greg, how are things going for you?
Oh, I'm good. I'm going to indulge in an anecdote that I told over your shoulder earlier today when we were hanging out, which is I recently had the privilege of guest starring on an episode of Coffee with Kenobi, which is one of the biggest Star Wars podcasts around. And we talked about Willow. And during that discussion, the host, a really great guy named Dan Z, was complaining about one of the characters in Willow being inconsistent. And I was like, dang it, it's the Tylor thing. And I said to him, I'm really sorry to have to tell you this, but this is how my podcast host would explain it, because it was a teenager acting inconsistently and he was upset that this character was inconsistent. And Dan is a high school teacher. So like I watched the light drain out of his face. He's like, dang it, that's exactly right. So I gave you a shout out as being a very smart, cool person. If anybody's interested in Willow, if you're watching that show, I don't know if anybody is, but we had a good discussion about the 6th episode over on the Coffee with Kenobi feed, and he's done all of them. So
if you're going to give me shout outs as a smart, cool person, you might want to worry about whether or not your shout outs are going to be valued in the future. But I appreciate that.
It reminded me, I think you know The Office a little bit. There's this beautiful joke on The Office where Michael Scott says, I'd never say this to her face, but Pam is a really talented artist and a wonderful person.
And then Ellie Kemper's just amazing. Why wouldn't you say that to her face?
Why wouldn't you say it? Yeah. It's so good. So it felt like one of those. So I'm like, I'm at least going to confess it to Tylor. Yep. So, but we have business at hand. Yes. Take us into a ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast.
I am so glad you had to say that this week instead of me. So this week we are going to be discussing the chapter icon on chapter 4, which is an image of the Horn of Valir. And as usual, I'm going to let you do the general overview, but I will say this is like the 3rd or 4th chapter icon in a row that I think our main comment is going to be, oh my God, it's so dark. And with that, I am going to throw to you, Greg. What are your initial thoughts upon seeing this image?
Well, and it's silly to word it this way, but deliberately dark. Like it went out of its way to be dark, because there are so many layers to this, where we've discussed before how they can often kind of stack the layers. But this is a black horn on a black background, and layers of the horn are black. So first you stole my main point, but I will then say my mind went back to when we talked about the map in episode 1 of this season, and we discovered it was the same image as on the previous book's map, but the horn is there as well, and I will say it looks slightly different. I mean, it's been turned slightly, which doesn't really matter, but I would say the key difference I see is that in the image on the map, the 3 circles within it are very much balanced, that they're about the same size and they're interlocked so that there's a kind of clear center of the image. In this one, we have one of the circles is much larger than the other 2, which kind of actually, I would say all three look slightly different in size, but particularly one is very large, which pushes kind of the center off to the side a bit. And that looks a little different. So those are the two things that jump to mind first.
Yeah, and I think that that observation about the difference in the horn actually probably goes back potentially to what you actually described in your comparison, which is that the map is the same as the first book, whereas this chapter icon doesn't appear until the second book. And so my suspicion is that this is Robert Jordan maybe not changing his mind about anything, but kind of refining his image of what this horn looks like, or maybe getting a different thought about the symbology of the rings on the inside and then altering it. My initial thought upon seeing this, and I noticed the same difference you did, was to say this to me seems like it's almost more evocative of the image that in my book is on the opposite page, the snake eating its own tail and the
Mm,
wheel. Because I think in that image, it's always struck me as a little bit odd that the circles are almost the same size. It seems like if we're thinking about the symbol of the Aes Sedai and the wheel of time, the wheel should be a little bigger than it is in that image. This kind of seems to fit what I think of as the balance of that kind of snake eating its own tail kind of wheel image that I would have in my head if you described it to me and didn't give me the image that was attached to the chapters. So I think this is possibly more evocative of that link to deep time and the wheel itself. And so I kind of wonder whether this is a refinement by Robert Jordan, as going into the second book, he kind of wanted to make that connection a little bit clearer than it was in the initial image. That was way too much detail for a very small discussion. But I think you're also right to say it is kind of intentionally darkly layered. I think the thing that really stood out to me is you were describing like the horn is dark and the background is dark. And then I immediately jumped to, and the frame of the dark background is dark.
hmm
And so I think you're exactly right. There's something to how deep and dark this image is, which given where the horn is right now doesn't make any sense at all unless there's something we're not seeing. And so I think this is maybe an intriguing chapter image in light of where we're at and where the horn is at currently in the story. It doesn't seem like it's in a dark place. um does that kind of connect?
Yeah. So the piece I'm missing there is they did find it in the eye
The
of the
eye.
world,
Yeah.
and the eye was the pooling of the male power, the Sidene,
Yes.
and that is the darker half of the symbol.
Yeah, so traditionally that has been in like the black and white cookie.
Yeah.
Sidene is always the black, the dark side. And I think that's something that's interesting to know, is that black potentially in this symbology is both male and evil, which in the
Mm.
world it makes sense those would be linked, but in the like deep history of the world they wouldn't potentially be linked, right? So this is maybe, a deeper discussion about what does dark actually mean in these books, but definitely I think tying those two things is interesting together, especially because the horn doesn't seem to be especially, directly tied to male or female. It doesn't seem tied to the power at all, and so it's an interesting image to be especially dark in light of it doesn't seem like it's in a dark place in the story. It doesn't seem like it's an evil object, and it doesn't seem like it's especially tied to the male side of the power, other than, as you say, where it rested historically, which maybe is what they're getting at here. But it's kind of an image that to me makes me say, okay, what's going to go on with this horn that makes it such a dark image? At
Yeah.
first glance, it seems out of place to me. Is there anything else you had on this image?
Only and again, I think I landed in the step one you just walked through, and so my mind was naturally going to that step two, which is where is this going to go? And then I was
Yeah.
reminded that this is potentially going to call back heroes from the dead, and we have had the powers of darkness talk about kind of those necromantic powers. So yeah, it hasn't been dark yet, but they're you know this is the emo kid with dark eyeliner.
Yeah.
There's potential to go dark here.
It's very Bruce Wayne. I like it.
Yeah.
I think the last thing that I will note about this chapter icon is what does it stand for when it shows up at the beginning of a chapter? Usually it means the Horn of Valir is in the chapter. There's not a whole lot symbology here. So with that, why don't we dive straight into chapter 4, Summoned, which is very exciting for me, mostly because it is a Moiraine POV, and you all know how I feel about Rand getting all of the POVs, so this is wonderful. So we begin with Moiraine adjusting her Aes Sedai shawl and briefly kind of discussing a number of different kind of traditions of Tar Valon and which have been brought here and which haven't. And I will say this chapter is kind of a deluge of images and phrases and things we're supposed to kind of partially pick up on. I'm going to breeze through it quickly so we can discuss that later on. There is a knock at the door. She knows that Shienarans do not typically knock, and so she knows that these must be Aes Sedai. When she opens the door, there are two Aes Sedai there. They are Anaya, who is another blue, the same Aja as Moiraine, and Liandrin, who is a red. As they are talking, it becomes clear that Moiraine is kind of thinking of Anaya as an ally and Liandrin in some way as an adversary, and Moiraine is repeatedly kind of wondering what Liandrin is up to and what her plans are. Eventually, they make their way into the chambers of the Merlin seat. They make their way in and they are greeted by a character whose name I cannot believe is pronounced the way that it is. Quick, Greg, Leane.
Leane. Leane. Leane.
Liana.
No.
Yeah, I know. I know.
Okay.
It's
This is your fight
Liana.
with the gallery. Liana.
Oh
Okay.
my God, I hate this glossary so much. There are like 6 pronunciations in it that are terrible. But Liana. So Liana is the keeper of the chronicles. She is, it seems, kind of the second to the Merlin seat. She brings Moiraine in, and the three of them have a conversation. And during this conversation, it becomes increasingly clear that Moiraine is uncomfortable with Liana being in the room. We are briefly introduced to the Merlin seat, Suan Sancha. She was a farmer. She speaks her mind. And this conversation that we see between them primarily concerns, well, first off, we learn that the Merlin is here because something, she has learned that Moiraine is interfering with some ta'veren, which we assume is Rand. She learned this from Elida, who has been telling everyone who she can find and has even returned to Tar Valon to try to deal with this issue. And so it seems that the Merlin seat is kind of chastising Moiraine. And the conversation briefly touches on the boys that she's met and whether or not, she is going to be, interacting with, any new politics in Tar Valon. We learn about the alliance between the Reds and the Greens, which is bizarre, apparently. And finally, we learn that Moiraine believes that discovering Nynaeve and Egwene will more than offset any gains that the Reds have recently had. She believes that finding those two is very important. And we briefly learn in this chapter that it turns out the Aes Sedai are kind of shrinking over time. The number of them who are being recruited seems to be going down more and more. And then at the end of the chapter, we have the Merlin seat send Liana out of the room. And then immediately after she leaves, Suan basically says, "For what we've done, we could be stilled." And the chapter ends, leaving us to wonder what is going on. Luckily, we read the next chapter, so we know what is going on. Greg, I think that this is a really interesting chapter because it's from a new POV, and with that, we get about 800 new words and phrases, some of which we kind of figure out what they mean throughout the chapter, and some of which are left hanging. So, as a new reader, the kind of question I want to throw to you with before we kind of start going through this chronologically is, what were the one or two things that you don't think are super important, kind of little details, but ones that had you the most intrigued or most interested in this chapter?
I'm gonna cheat on one, but I swear this is my true reaction, which when I think it's Liandrin is so sweet to Amalisa.
Yes.
Right. That stood out. And I think Moiraine, I mean, signals is like, hey, that's weird. And that stood out to me because well, I remembered, for one, you had kind of been like, oh, this Anglemar is kind of cool, right? And I'm like, okay, is this more of that puzzle kind of coming together? But it was such a unnecessary character entrance. It was like, okay, so they purposely want to set up that there's a link between these, and why I'm cheating is that
It pays off
comes.
in 10 pages. Yeah.
Yeah. So certainly that one stood out. Um and then I guess the detail, and I don't think this quite answers your question because I'm sure it's a big thing, but the one that I really stuck on, and they repeat it many times, is that there have been three more false dragons, which is
Yeah.
six in the last 2 years. And when they hammer that home, I don't know, it felt to me like the momentum really mattered. It brought to mind like the world is spinning faster and faster. I know that's not literally true in this mythology, but it's like we're coming around to the same pattern over and over again, and this is becoming an age of heroes or what have you because of those. So I think those two details were the kind of the two I really stuck out on. I'll just add in that I felt kind of bored in the middle, and then this last hook really pulled me back, which kept me deeply engaged for the next chapter, especially, right? So I think that's exactly what he was doing. Right, like
Yeah.
Robert Jordan knew this kind of info dump would be a little dry, so he's like, let's throw a little spice in here to win them back over for part two of the info dump.
Yeah, and I will say, I think that this chapter is really indicative of the difference between Robert Jordan in The Eye of the World and Robert Jordan in later books, because I find The Eye of the World to be a book that is really fun to read the first time, kind of extra fun to read the second time, and then it falls off a little bit, right? I'm kind of like, okay, I know all of this stuff. A lot of these later books, because they are a little bit more dense in some places, because we're jumping around from POV to POV, so we're getting new details and new information constantly. I think they reward rereading a little bit more, which is partially why I enjoy some of the later books more than that earlier one. But I think it also kind of creates a little bit more of a, kind of density problem for first time readers, right? Whereas The Eye of the World is really, really fun the first time. I feel like some of these early chapters in The Great Hunt do sometimes feel a little bit homework for me. And I will say my rankings of these books haven't changed a ton over time, but for a long time, this was my least favorite Wheel of Time book until I have come around on it a little bit more. And this is partially why I always get mad in the first like 20 chapters of this book at Robert Jordan going back to all of his bad habits from The Eye of the World. And it frustrates me to no end. And I think what you're bringing up is a perfect example of that. Just, okay, we know the world. Don't keep giving us hanging things. Give us new things that we can latch our teeth into and do something with. And this chapter, I don't think quite does enough of that.
Yeah.
So, of all of the things that we haven't had a chance to kind of dig into too much, I think I just want to kind of work through the chapter pretty chronologically. I have like 12 stars in my notes, which never happens. So let's keep this relatively orderly. I want to start at the beginning of the chapter where we learn that at least in Tarvalon, the Aes Sedai literally wear their ajas on their sleeves, right? They have these shawls that include fringe that is colored for their aja. And so it seems very clear that this is kind of the political fault lines that we're going to be following. So this is, the discussion of ajas is kind of, buried throughout this chapter, and I think 4 or 5 places. But I'm curious what you picked up on, what you found interesting, and then what follow-up questions you have, which I can either partially or not at all answer, depending on what is in the chapter and what isn't. So what did you think about kind of the discussion of ajas all the way from traditions at the beginning of the chapter through kind of like politics and fault lines later on in the chapter?
Yeah, the relationship between Eye of the World and then this book in terms of this particular topic reminded me a lot. In the Lord of the Rings movies, you kind of get a sense that the white and the gray matter in the witch. And
Yeah.
then you come back for The Hobbit, and because they needed to stretch that book out, they're like, here's a brown. Now these really matter. Let's talk more about what all these different wizard ranks mean.
Yeah.
And so it felt a little like that. I would say my kind of top line takeaway is that it is much more fractured than we would have believed from kind of the early portrayals of the Aes Sedai.
Yeah.
Everybody outside of this has just viewed them as kind of a solid group that's like, don't trust them or they're out for their own good. But the pattern here is that there's court intrigue, right? I mean, it felt very much like one of those types of books all of a sudden, with the factions and with the backstabbing and who wants to outmaneuver who. I was actually thinking a lot about the movie The Favorite. Did you see that
Oh
two
yeah,
years ago? Yeah, it was great.
it was
Olivia
fantastic.
Colman. Yeah, yeah. And just kind of that kind of style of I don't watch like Downton Abbey or The Crown
I
or
do. They're
any
wonderful.
Bridgerton. I've missed the boat on these, but so what seems to me the key dynamic then to really answer your question is that the current Amerlin seat,
Suan is how I've always
Suan,
pronounced it. I believe that is show accurate. I can watch that episode and double check, but
she is a blue
yes,
and
was a blue. This
was
is
a blue
actually a point of discussion in this chapter. Is the Merlin seat and the keeper are supposed to be without Aja, and the
without
fact that
office.
people are treating them as blue was, scandalous to them. Sorry, continue.
Right. And so clearly it seems Moiraine has kind of been groomed to be the next Amerlin seat, and yet the idea of two successive blues is really upsetting, particularly the reds and the greens, and that they are acting out to fight them. Now, you reminded me last episode that there are 7
Correct.
Ajas, and so we have blue, green, red mentioned here. Brown was mentioned a few times as kind of the
Correct.
the kind of recordy, sciencey types.
Scholars is a pretty good way of
Scholars.
thinking of it. Yep.
Yeah. Wait, so that's 4.
Yep.
Do they include black in the
That
7?
is not one of the 7. There are
Okay.
7 official.
Okay.
We also in this chapter have a very quick reference to a yellow. We don't get any details about what that looks like, but we do at least get a 5th color.
I was going to make a joke about describing yellow to you since you didn't know what yellow looks like, but I don't know how to do that. I was like, well, it's a kind of a warm color. So one of my main notes right here in the middle of my page is that this is just really messy. There's intrigue, there's factions, there's rivals. And so I think even before we get to the revelation at the very end of the chapter, I was immediately less confident in Moraine's ability to have any effect because, you know, whatever fiction, sci-fi does this all the time, fantasy does this all the time. It's like the messier the power, the messier that those in power are, the less effective they are, and you have to work around them. I mean, this is essentially the Star Wars prequels, right? And eventually the Star Wars sequels. And it's the idea that like when you can't trust those in power when they're out for themselves, when corruption is present, all of those things, then you're going to have to go it alone. And so I assume that's kind of one of the key takeaways here. The next chapter kind of complicates that a little bit, but that's where I was.
I think that's an interesting narrative to think of actually in light of the next chapter, right? Because what we learn in the next chapter is that the people going it alone are potentially Suan and Moiraine. And I think that it's really interesting in light of how Moiraine reacts when the Merlin arrives, right? This is the first time we've been in her head, period, other than a couple of paragraphs at the end of the last book. And one of the first things she thinks in this chapter is she is not worried about the Merlin being here, despite the fact that she thinks there must be a horrible reason for the Merlin to have traveled. Rather, she is worried in this at the beginning of this chapter about who the Merlin has brought with her. And I think that that is really telling, that in light of later on, we learn why Moiraine isn't worried about Suan, but the fact that she is still, in spite of that close connection, worried about the other, I think we said last time, 14 or 15 Aes Sedai who are with her, that's really important to, I think, be reading into, is how worried Moiraine is about this. Because as you said, I think in the previous book, Tar Valon was portrayed as a place of safety and a place of unity. It was Moiraine who was doing that portraying for the most part. And so the fact that she thinks of it as so fractured, she's afraid of it, while also painting that rosy picture, I think kind of tells us something about Moiraine. And this was actually the other thing I wanted to mention about the very early section of this chapter before the other Aes Sedai arrive, is we get a brief discussion of Moiraine saying, Moiraine knows that other Aes Sedai know she has secret tricks. Some other Aes Sedai overestimate those secret tricks, and Moiraine is planning on taking advantage of those overestimations in this current interaction. And I think that tells us something about how Moiraine thinks in a way that we really have kind of surmised from the way that she's been planning, but we haven't really seen it in action from her POV in that way. And I thought that was a really intriguing and interesting moment. So I'm curious what you think about kind of our first time in Moraine's head and either that moments or other telling character moments, and also just any last thoughts you have on this early section of the chapter before we get into many of the other Aes Sedai who show up.
I was kind of constantly had it in my mind about why are we in Moraine's head? Why is it that it's taken this long? And, what's the advantage of being here? And definitely across the two chapters, we get our answer, which is, we need this larger understanding of what's going on and how this small quest we've been on plays a part here. And I think that's the easiest and the most correct answer as well, right? That like we had to see all of this through her eyes. But her gift is one I keep forgetting, right? The kind of her specific gift, not her general powers and so on. So I think there's no doubt in my mind that we were reminded of it here for a very specific reason. As we were reintroduced to all the other characters, we're reintroduced to her through this, so we should bear that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it bears mentioning that this is a direct reference to the end of the last book, right? So I think it is both, as you're saying, kind of a reference to, hey, this ability to kind of listen in on people, to, eavesdrop is something we should be, keying in on. It's almost like a Chekhov's gun kind of situation, right? We just assume that skill will become valuable later on. But I think it's also putting into our minds kind of the last time that she used this skill, which was specifically in eavesdropping on Rand and declaring he is the dragon reborn, right? So I think this is cleverly done by Jordan to both give us an effective character moment and also just a nice little like mental nudge, right? Put you in the headspace to remember exactly what's going on in the story here. And I think that leads us interestingly into the fact that we then get just a pile of new characters, right? All of the names get thrown around. I think the most interesting one for me, and I assume from the discussion we've had so far, possibly for you as well, is Liandrin. We get this interesting character who is clearly a foil for Moiraine. We get some kind of like dark vibes in this chapter. We get some really dark vibes in the next chapter. What was your response to Liandrin's introduction? And then obviously she is kind of, the counterpoint to her is the super bubbly Anaya, who seems to, kind of counterbalance what we're seeing there. What were your thoughts on these new character introductions?
Yeah, Liandrin is definitely the Draco to Moraine's Harry. And, it was good. I immediately felt like, oh, good. We needed somebody to be challenging her because it's too easy to just trust her and so on. And even though I found myself, already hating Liandrin for that reason, it's like, no, this is good to make sure we're questioning her actions and not just following along. The idea that this is kind of an equal, but an equal who is more standoffish and kind of doesn't connect well with people, particularly struck me just because Moiraine, even though I don't think Jordan has hung a lot of lanterns on this, she does connect well with people, right? Like in every situation, I'm actually thinking of the innkeeper who she just kind of immediately knew to trust and like all's cool with him. So we've seen her time and time again take these characters who are skeptical of her and kind of smooth things out. And so now we have Liandrin who it's like, wait, why does she care about Amalisa? Right? Like she doesn't, she's not the type to do that. And both helps that connection stand out, but also just kind of remind us that, oh yeah, Moiraine kind of does have this power.
Yeah, and this actually kind of pings two things for me. One is that Liandrin feels like every character I have ever seen in a Dungeons and Dragons game played by someone who loves numbers, right? They're just like, okay, I can put an 8 in charisma. My character doesn't care about it. And you get Liandrin, who is just like hard and cold and evil and duh, right?
Yeah.
But I think also kind of tied up in that is Liandrin. I think, as you say, you immediately ping like, okay, this is the Malfoy to the Potter, right? But I think that also is tapping into a lot of it's a trope, it's a type, it's a thing we've seen repeatedly. And this is something Robert Jordan typically does that I find interesting is he really likes taking types and then changing one thing about them to make them really interesting. And at least in this first like chapter and a half, I'm not finding the immediate like thing to latch onto as
Mm,
Leandrin is dramatically different from that type, right?
yeah.
Typically, I'm used to we saw, the immediately one that jumps to my mind was the wolf brother who taught Perrin, Elias, right? He's this kind of
Mm.
like wilderness wild man, but he's also, extremely thoughtful and talkative and charismatic in a way you typically don't see. Do you see anything in the Leandrin character that surprised you or that struck you as outside of type, or is she still kind of just playing straight by the like Malfoy foil character kind of rules?
No, I think I referenced this Harry Potter moment in a previous episode when it's when the Death Eaters show up and it's like, oh, everybody who's been slightly grumpy to Harry over time,
Yep.
and it felt very much like that. Sorry, the revelation at the end of the second chapter here felt
Yeah.
a lot like that. It's like, oh, she's kind of grumpy. Guess what? She's a baddie.
Yeah.
And so I think, yeah, I wasn't surprised and I wasn't like, whoa, that's an interesting spin on this. I think when you get a character like that, my mind's like, okay, long term, are we talking then just complete heal the whole time, or is there a redemption here? And
Right.
so I don't even know which one I would consider more surprising at this point because both are so common. So if Jordan really wants to surprise me, he's probably got to find some third pathway forward.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting to be thinking about for some of these characters that are being introduced now, right? Leandrin, we're getting, real sketchy vibes real early, but I think we're also seeing a bunch of other names thrown around in this chapter that, we don't get any real detail about them. We learn about a couple of Browns. I think it's like Varen and Seraphel or something. Maybe that's the wrong S name. But we get like 6 or 7 different Aes Sedai here, and I think it's interesting to note while none of them really stand out other than Leandrin, some of them have to at some point later become something big. I think I
Mm.
recognized all but one of the names of these
Oh wow.
characters just going through them. So this is just something that I want to just note about Robert Jordan. We don't need to go through all of the random names and pretend like they're all important now, but just be taking notes. I literally started an Aes Sedai notebook recently where I'm just like, okay, who is this random name again? Because it's gonna get difficult to remember all of them. Just be aware. Um, the other thing in this conversation I wanted to note is something you mentioned right after the summary. This is the section where Leandrin and our other Aes Sedai are giving news, right? They are telling about the false dragons elsewhere, and we get yet another reference to Toman Head and the Almoth Plain, which we've seen a few times. So I was curious. I know you mentioned the 3 dragons at once being really interesting and jumping out to you. Were there any details in this scene that stood out, or anything that you really latched onto as like this feels like it's going to be important going forward with all of these false dragons appearing out of nowhere?
So that one, number one. Number two in my notes was to see that Elena and Gawain had arrived at Tar Valon. That felt less like it was just an update. It's like not new.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, remember those characters headed that way? They're there. But also that Logain was gentled, and they all are kind of like, yeah, so he wasn't a big threat, except that he costs 3 lives
Yeah.
before being. Is it in the gentling that they died, or is it just before he was kind of under control?
My guess would be the latter, but I don't think
Yeah.
it's specified in the text. But just based on like once someone's gentle, no, 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 it's kind of over. So it would have to be pretty much the second.
Yeah. And then so the update on that, and then remembering again that Elaine is training and Gowan will be a warder, as I
Yep.
recall. And then the next section, what I noted, my kind of summary comment is just like the general takeaway is that there is unrest everywhere, that
Yeah.
there's a lot of factions in every region in every city, as you mentioned, the Toman's Head and the Plain. And all I could think about was back to the prologue. It's like, yeah, he was charging the agents of chaos, and surprise, they're creating chaos everywhere. And while there were lots of specifics I could have gotten like sucked into of like what's happening with which factions where, I just kind of said, well, I think what I'm supposed to see here is you have a small force of Aes Sedai who could not possibly, nor is it necessarily their job to control and contain all of these problems. And it's just chaos breaking out everywhere is just completely overwhelming whatever sense of order there is, either political or spiritual or what have you. Yeah, I mean, again, I talk Star Wars. These are the Jedi in the prequels, right? Like the point of the Clone Wars was to stretch the Jedi really, really thin so that they started making stupid choices, and then you could just undermine their power and get rid of them. And so it feels very much in that same spirit that the Aes Sedai have been
Yeah.
stretched thin, that their numbers are lower. They're losing 3 of them to a false dragon, and we're going to have more false dragons. So it just seems to me that something needs to change dramatically for the Aes Sedai, or they're going to fall.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the right big picture takeaway, right? This is something I often tell my students, right? Is there are the big messages and then there are the little details you kind of need to hang on to. That's the big message. That's all we need to get from this section. A few little details that jumped out to me just as like, maybe these are little hints or just things that were intriguing. First off, we learn that while there are 3 false dragons, only one of them can actually channel. So that's potentially an interesting note. Second, we learn that there have been riots in Andor, and that they have recently been quelled. And then finally, the one that kind of jumped out to me is we learned that the sea folk are not just, as you said, kind of unsettled, but the sea folk are actually looking for their chosen one, who is referred to as the Coromur. And so I think this is really interesting to think that not only do we have kind of unrest all over the world, but with all of the attention being given to the prophecies of the dragon, to think there are other cultures who also have their own chosen ones. I think that's a really interesting detail to get thrown into all of these other things that are happening here. Greg is laughing about something. I don't
You
know
know what
what's
I'm
going
laughing
on
about.
over there.
I'm not going to talk to you about the movie we watched this morning
Oh,
that you desperately did not like, but was structured very much in that same way
that is
with
correct.
sea
Yes.
people and wanting a chosen one, like I don't know, a Taruk Makta, say, or some such. I'm only laughing at Tyler's pain in regards to the Avatar franchise, which
Oh
I
my
guess
God, it
is
was
what we
so
need
bad.
to call it now. That's my laughter. But yes, the sea people, again, I had pulled out on those early references that we were suddenly had the fact that there were sea people, there are people off of this continent, and
Sea
then to
folk,
hear
just to be clear.
sea folk, and then to hear that they are kind of in their own epic mythic moment, right? The searching for a chosen one. They're not just quiet fishermen. They're seeking something. Yeah, that stood out to me as well. And not something an agent of chaos would have started either, right? Different
Right.
in its own regard in that way too.
Well, and I think that that's what's so interesting to me about this is we are seeing in this sequence fallout from what we had witnessed in the previous book and hints of new things and hints of fallout from the prologues and things that couldn't be anything related to anything we've seen so far. And I think this is something Robert Jordan does a really good job of in general when we are getting kind of rumors or like hearing the news of the world. He does a really good job of mixing in enough, wheat with the chaff and enough interesting things from before and things that we can draw links to. He always makes these info dumps work by giving enough variety of kind of the types of things and how they tie into the story we've seen so far. Unless you have anything else to say about the broader world, we get quickly ushered through the entryway and into the Merlin's chamber, and then we get a big long info dump about the politics of the tower. Lots of reds being aligned with greens, and Moiraine being sent to do service overseen by the reds, and it's a lot. What did you make of this kind of discussion between Moiraine and the Merlin Sea? I know you said you kind of were, zoning out a little bit by the end. What were your big takeaways here?
Yeah, that's probably is the section I was kind of like, I've had enough of this kind of mode of thinking, right? And that
Mhm.
is more a criticism of myself than it. But one of the things I mean, this threat that not only is it that the Reds and Greens are sick of the Blues being in charge, but specifically targeting Moiraine as kind of the heir apparent and wanting her
Yeah.
to be put down, not gentle necessarily, but or stilled, excuse me, stilled, right?
Right. For
Um,
women, it's still.
yeah. So the threat there being that, like, yeah, let's find well, I mean, not to get too real, but it's Benghazi, right? It's like, let's find a way to
Yep.
make her incapable of leading. um that stood out to me. And then the real piece, I think I was in a headspace where I was more attached to the familiar, so I wrote down in big letters, Eleda narked, because we have this kind of account of the fact that Eleda, the Aes Sedai that was working for in
In
uh
Andor for Morghese, yeah.
yes, the city is Camerlin, right?
Camelin, yeah.
Camelin. So in Camelin, we knew she was headed to search uh for Rand and the boys after Rand had been present in the court. But we got a little bit more of a hint that she actually figured out that they are Taviran, and basically ran off to the tower to narc on Moiraine and to say that Moiraine is up to something really serious, and obviously giving fuel to the fire of her enemies. And again, first reading as opposed to next chapter reading, I was like, oh, she's getting Moiraine in a lot of trouble. That this seat is going to be, the seat up until this moment has been presented as the heaviest of heavies, and so she's going to be really angry, and Moiraine is going to face consequences for all these actions that we'd been rooting for her to get done all the way through the first book.
Yeah, and I think this is a really effective, as you say, number one, it turns out to be a really effective bait and switch, right? We think she is about to have the hammer come down, and then it turns out it's like her best friend. But I think this also works really effectively to set up kind of a second set of problems for Moiraine. I remember when I was very young, I thought that I was going to be like a fiction writer. That was my dream. And I
Still
remember,
could be, man. Go
no,
turn into it, lean in,
no, it
self-publish.
can't. Uh, but I remember reading one of the pieces of advice was never stop giving your characters problems, right? That characters who don't have conflict are boring, and so you constantly want to just be piling things on top of your characters until it feels like you can't write your way out of all of those problems. That, I think, is what this feels like Jordan is doing here for Moiraine. He's very effectively set up kind of her role in prophecy, her role in Rand and Matt and Perrin's lives, and now this is to say, okay, well, while she's doing all of that, she also has to juggle this political problem that is slowly building up for her, of more and more people being willing to embrace basically taking her out of the game entirely as punishment for things she's done in the past. So I think this is fairly effective, both, as you say, at setting up that bait and switch where it looks like something heavy is about to fall on our characters' heads and then it's nothing, but also setting up a real problem that I think could kind of evolve as time goes forward.
Yeah, and I I think that's where my head was, and that's, again, at the end of a chapter with a lot of a dump. It's like, okay, these are long-term things, and the long term is just not important to me right now. Right? Like, I got to
Right.
wrap my head around. I like the hints about what this book is going to be about at this particular moment, and I kind of just have to say there's too many names, too many places. I'm going to set aside the deep teases, and
Yeah.
I'm sure I'll love them later, but I'm going to set aside those for now, I think, is where my head was. And I think, as you just described it, I knew the seat was what this book is about, and
Yep.
I think those larger factions and potential consequences will be there later.
Well, and I think this is something Robert Jordan does really well in many scenes later on, is he gets us invested in situations like this by putting characters we care about in the situations with stakes, right?
Mm.
And the problem I think Robert Jordan runs into sometimes early in these books is he doesn't have the cast of characters built up yet to be able to put all of the characters in all of the interesting places to tell all of the stories. So some of them kind of have to come through exposition and info dumps like this. And I think the deeper into the story you get, the more likely it would be we would have someone in the room who we could, go to their POV, rather than needing Suan and Moiraine to have a big long discussion about it and, let us in on it. So this, I think, is the challenge in these early books, right? Is this is valuable information that we need at some point in the future, but it's hard to give that information in an interesting way unless you have characters you're invested in those places, and we just don't have enough characters we're invested in yet to get to all the places we want to be seeing things coming from. That honestly, I have a couple of like really little quick hit details, but that's the last of my big stuff on this chapter. Was there anything else you wanted to cover? And then I can just do a couple of like sprinkle the breadcrumbs things before we move into the next chapter.
Um, no, I did think that we've seen a theme emerge a few times about having a public self and a private self.
Yeah.
And I just so my last note we haven't really talked about is just I noted that for here. And I think that really is my offering of a like transition because it really is like, okay, now we were the public selves. Let's kick out the other I already forgot her job.
Liana somehow.
Liana, the lore keeper, the
The
record
Keeper of Chronicles.
keeper of chronicles. Let's kick her out, and then we can be our real selves. But I wasn't entirely sure what that was going to be yet. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, the only other couple little things that I had to mention in this section, first off, is just I think it's very interesting. We mentioned this once before, but it's good to just keep it in our heads. The White Tower is shrinking, and that should raise questions, as you were saying before, about things like how devastating is losing three Aes Sedai? How small is this group actually, and what does that allow them the power or influence to do? The other thing that I thought was really interesting here was the way that information seems to be flowing in Faldara. The fact that information is kind of getting ahead of Moiraine. We see the Horn of Valir has arrived before Moiraine had even told the Merlin about it. The Merlin has already heard of the three village youths and Moraine's interactions with them. She had already heard that there were young girls who might be channelers with Moiraine. And this is something that we've kind of seen at the very end of the previous book, but it's worth noting kind of information keeps kind of going faster than Moiraine is prepared for in a way that, didn't seem likely in the early parts of the previous book. And with that, we can then move on to information that Moiraine has that no one else does in chapter 5, The Shadow in Shienar. So we begin this chapter with Moiraine and Siuan kind of revealing that they are close friends. They have known each other since they were novices in the tower, and that they are connected because they both believe that they are going to help usher the Dragon Reborn and fulfill the prophecies. We get a bit of a discussion about whether or not they have done something wrong and will be stilled, about whether or not they can trust Lyanna or any of the other Aes Sedai, and they kind of settle on the position that no, they can't. They are the only ones who can be involved in this. What they're doing could be easily seen as traitorous or rebellion or something along those lines. In that discussion, we do get a decent description of the two Merlins who had previously been deposed and killed, and that's just a little bit of kind of history and lore dump. We then also get a little bit of a discussion of the Horn of Valir, and this is where Moiraine reveals her plan for Rand. She plans to get Mat and Perrin to take the Horn of Valir to Ilion and get Rand to tag along because he'll want to stay with his friends as long as he can. And Moraine's hope is that she can then either get him to declare himself as the Dragon Reborn, or as she says, she has the means to declare him even if he doesn't want it. And therefore, he will be the Dragon Reborn in Ilion with the Horn of Valir. And she says that should win over a major nation to his cause without him even having to do anything. Siuan seems kind of convinced by this plan, but is, kind of worried that she can't do anything. She's stuck in Tar Valon, and B, seems to think that they are getting cornered in politically and they need to, do things quickly. Things are starting to outpace them. And they also briefly discuss how close the end of the world, the last battle, is becoming. At this point, we jump to a few other POVs. We get a POV from Joffrey Bornhald, who was one of the White Cloaks who captured Perrin in the previous book. He is leading 2,000 White Cloaks through Terabon. He recalls his discussion with Padron Niall, the head of the White Cloaks, telling him to go there and not be seen. He then interacts with a number of questioners of the White Cloaks. They have killed an entire village to keep secrecy. They basically give him some orders, and Joffrey Bornhald is confused but has to go along with them. Of note, it's worth noting the questioners, we have a description of their cloaks. They have crooks on their cloaks, similar to the character in the prologue of this book. So that's worth noting. It is a questioner who we are looking looking for if we're looking for our dark friend from the prologue. We then get a Leandrin chapter. She goes to Amalisa's offices or her quarters. She immediately dismisses all of the servants and everyone else, and then she reveals that she has a kind of hidden power in the same way that Moiraine does, but while Moiraine seems kind of innocuous, it lets you eavesdrop, Leandrin's seems kind of dark. It allows her to, if not torture, at least extract information and kind of prey on the fears of someone. She does this to Amalisa. She says she wants the truth, she wants information, and then the chapter ends with her giving orders that we don't get access to. Finally, there's a very brief section from the perspective of Padan Fain. I believe my entire description of this chapter is he says at some point, not who I expected. And that's basically the only important thing in that section. So this is what I love about the Wheel of Time, dancing around to a bunch of different perspectives, getting hints and clues and not quite knowing exactly what's going on. What was your reaction to The Shadow and Shienar?
Is it correct to say that this is our first chapter where we've split POV before?
I think we have had one or two chapters with a single POV switch, but this is certainly the first time that we have had more than two character POVs in the same chapter.
It was surprising, and maybe I'd forgotten the other ones or hadn't been paying as much attention. But I'm like, oh, we're actually jumping around and geographically. I mean, we come back, but the interlude is far off. So, I mean, that makes me think, why do you do that instead of having chapters for those characters? And, having a full POV chapter is a promotion of a character, I would say. And so that seems like one reason not to do it. Like, we don't need to promote Jeffrin Barnhold to that level.
Correct.
But then the second reason seems to be because you want to emphasize that these pieces are happening simultaneously. And that is something Robert Jordan avoided in Eye of the World, right? We would kind of zip forward in Perrin and then go back and go through that time period with Rand again. So we could have, at any one of those moments, jumped between them to see how these timelines sync up, but he didn't want to. So to me, it was like, okay, so I should be paying attention to the fact that while this is happening, the Children of the Light are on the move, and a dark friend I assume is coming to Padan Fain. And there was a quote, I believe it was in the Jeffrin Barnhold, that said he felt like they were pieces of on a board being moved, or pieces of stone being moved around. And it just felt like that's what this is, right? All of these people. Again, I loved Andor that just wrapped up on Disney Plus about a month ago. And there's a great prison, and the prison is all about the levels, and like it's awesome. People should watch it. But one of the things I got a lot of credit for on one of my recap episodes was like, the thing about it is everybody in that show is actually in the prison system trying to compete to get out, and they just don't know it unless they're literally in the prison. And it just felt to me like, oh, the people at the very bottom know they're in a game, but not everybody else does. And I took this chapter to kind of mean everybody's in the game. Everybody's being pushed around by these forces.
Yeah, and I think in that discussion, there were a couple of interesting things that jumped out to me. So number one is the question of timing, because this is something that Robert Jordan is actually meticulous about. I will note, this is not my thing, but there are people who, based on the phases of the moon and the descriptions of how long travel takes, have mapped out exactly on what day every section of every Wheel of Time book takes place on, and there are no chronological contradictions. Robert Jordan knows when things happen, and they play out at exactly specific times. So I think you're exactly right to be noting kind of when are things happening, what is simultaneous. That's something to be keeping an eye on. And I think you're right. That's definitely part of what's happening here, especially I think with the Leandrin and Padan Fain chapters. We're trying to give kind of an impression that the dark is moving in multiple ways kind of simultaneously, and I think that's interesting. The other thing that I think is worth noting, just kind of quick hit metaphorically, you mention Bornhald discussing himself feeling like he was a piece on the Stones board. This is something that's just a quick note. If we're talking about kind of the big metaphor of games and Wheel of Time, it is stones, which appears to, from all descriptions, be the game Go, as opposed to chess, which is kind of the Western equivalent that we typically see in fantasy stories.
And Knives Out. That just makes me happy.
Yeah, that is correct. So I think at this point, it kind of makes sense to take this chapter chronologically. So at the end of the last chapter, you said the kind of twist had grabbed you. How did you feel about the payoff on that twist? That these two characters actually are quite close to one another and share a secret?
Loved it. Absolutely loved it. So to sudden and my love of Moiraine, it was just like, okay, so I love the Amarylline seat now. Like
Yep.
I'm all in and she's there. And while they portrayed that there's a little gap between them, that Moiraine has kind of had to operate out of contact and it seems to have annoyed the seat. It was striking to me that like, no, but it's not like that led to suspicion. It's like, okay, I
Right.
understand. You did what you had to do. Here's how we were doing. And I will say, as a part of that, the fact that the two of them are following a prophecy that they know about and are putting all of their faith into was also intriguing to me.
Yeah.
I mean, the silliest questions. Where did that prophecy come from? What did that prophecy say? Because we have heard that that gift is diminished of late, that there aren't as many people seeing prophecies or making prophecies. So why is it that they trust this one so much? And, where did it come from? I'm very interested in that.
Yeah, I think the way that Moraine describes it in the chapter is she says that they were chosen by the pattern and they were the only ones who are able to do whatever it is they're able to do. And it's not entirely clear whether it's because they're the only ones who got the prophecy, as you're kind of describing, or whether there was something else. But that idea of these two characters having been chosen at some point, I thought was really interesting, kind of in the same context as what you're describing. The other thing that I found really interesting in this section is the idea that Suan plants very early, that while they're in this together and while they believe that they are doing the right thing based on the prophecy, what they're doing is considered to be kind of traitorous potentially, right? It's not entirely clear how or why, but the fact that it's them against the world, I think, is an interesting way. This kind of diffuses the tension that we had in the previous chapter of is Moraine about to be punished, and it replaces it with a new, almost scarier tension, which I think is a pretty effective trick to pull here. What are your thoughts on these two characters kind of having this sort of long time mission, and as you say, having been separated for so long? And I will actually just note here before I toss to you, if you're a television show viewer, the relationship between these two characters is a little different on the TV show. Once we get some more hints, we'll talk about whether or not that's a thing in the books. Sit tight. Greg, that makes no sense to you. What are your thoughts on these two characters' interactions in this section?
So because everybody loves moral philosophers, I have been tackling as my first kind of let's call it fun book of the year, the book What Do We Owe Each Other, which is by T.M. Scanlon and has a central
Oh, to
role
each other.
To each other, has a central role in The Good Place television show Tyler and I both adore. And I think we've referenced, or we should reference more. We should reference every episode
That is
here.
correct. Yes.
um, and so one of the things that book, which is really dense philosophy, it's a tough hang, but it is making me think a lot about the reasons why we do the things that we do, and it would seem from what I'm gleaning from this book that moral philosophers have been thinking a lot about the difference between a reason and a desire, and if all reasons flow from a desire. But all of that is subtext for why I was kind of thinking a lot about the question you just asked about, like, well, how do we justify what we do? And so I would say these are two characters who have a baseline moral principle, which is that they are going to protect the light from the dark. And they are staying true to that baseline principle by rejecting the kind of rules that have inhibited their ability to do so. And that, what do we owe to each other? Did I get it right that time? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. That is all about this kind of philosophical structure of morality is based in the effect it has on the people around us. And
Mm.
so I would say these two characters owe it to the world to use the maximum amount of their powers to do what is right. So I think they are acting morally in their own mind and in my mind, but I do think that develops a really interesting tension when, for whatever reason, the world will reject them and punish them for doing what is right.
Yeah.
This is not unique to this book, but it is just a really kind of detailed version of it already.
Well, and I think the severity of that punishment is made really, really clear in this section, right? When we hear only two Merlins have ever been deposed and stilled, and Siwan is really worried that she will be the third. And so I think that kind of highlights exactly what you're describing, right? Choosing to be a moral person, as you're describing, in the face of those kind of, odds or those kind of risks. I think that kind of tells you what kind of people these are, right? The fact that they're
Yeah.
willing to continue to go forward with it, that kind of is the whole story. The other thing that I found really interesting in this section is the way that they are describing Rand's role in the process, right? Because Siwan initially says she's very angry at Moiraine. She says, "We had a plan. The plan was for you to bring the Dragon Reborn to Tar Valon so we could protect and guard that person," right? And then later on in the chapter, we have Moiraine talking about letting Rand go on his own and how much she's been guiding him or not guiding him. And then also we get the hint that Moiraine is like, yeah, I'm willing to let him go, but I can also force him to be declared the Dragon Reborn, right? So we've got all of this kind of tension in the way that they are talking about their plans for Rand or their plans for the dragon. The interesting phrasing that I just wanted to pull out and then I'll throw to you is the way that Moiraine phrases it is she doesn't say Rand al'Thor is the Dragon Reborn. She says Rand al'Thor will stand before the world as the Dragon Reborn. And I think that's an interesting way of phrasing it that kind of shows you a little bit about how those characters are thinking about that. So I was curious, kind of broadly, what were your thoughts on Moraine's plan, but also the way that she's kind of thinking about planning for other people in this way?
I think it to me, I'm having trouble articulating a specific comparison, but there's a familiar trope of we need the chosen one to choose independently, right? And that always brings attention to it. Actually, that makes me think of Milton and the Bible, right?
Yeah.
That you have to choose to be obedient and forcing you have to give somebody free will. I mean, that's what Milton comes down to. And so it seems to me that they are trying to preserve Rand's free will, that he is going to have to make the choice to take up this mantle. And so when you talk about that wording, it does make me wonder, is he potentially not the Dragon Reborn, right? Because that language is loose enough. We know there's a bunch more coming, and some more choices as the wheel continues to spin. So I think there's those two things, right? I think, and all the choices they describe, I have been struggling actually in one of my lesson plans to use the word manipulate without the negative connotation, because they are manipulating Rand and the other boys with the best of intentions, right? But I think in our society, we tend to put an automatic negative connotation on actually something that impedes our free will, right? You're not letting them make their choices freely. You're adjusting things so that they make a specific choice. And so I think, to me, I'm seeing this manipulation without that negative connotation, that they are acting morally to try to get Rand to make the right set of choices that the whole world needs him to make. But you need to have a light touch. All of that then just is compounded when you remember you're dealing with a teenage boy, right?
Yeah.
Like you're gonna, you're gonna push him the wrong way all too easily. So you have to give him that amount of freedom so he can willfully take up the mantle himself.
I will say that is quite wise and quite accurate, and I think it is actually more wise than Moiraine and Suan are being. Right? They didn't choose to have a light touch and be hands off with Rand. They're like, we tried to directly control him and
Mm.
force him, but he's a Taviran. It's not going to work. And so I think that's a really interesting. You're right. They arrive at the correct answer, but without any of the good reasoning that you just gave for them. That would have been a much better justification than
Mm.
the one that they actually gave.
See my son's future discussions with his therapist to know how right and wise those end up being.
Yeah, as someone who does not have children, I should not be praising one style over another. That was pretty much all that I had in the Merlin Moraine section. I think that kind of relationship being revealed is the thing that jumps out to me. Did you have anything else in the Moraine Suan section you wanted to discuss before we
Just
got to the other segments?
the smallest of things, they mentioned the Council of Nine, and I was not familiar with this, but we're meant to assume this is a council gathering at the Great Hunt.
Yeah.
And at the council, that is where Rand could declare himself dragon, and it would have more impact at the Council of the Nine.
This is possibly the tiniest bit of information that you wouldn't have, but I don't care. The Council of the Nine is the ruling council of the country of Ilion. So that would be like saying, that would be like saying you were going to go to some major event in Washington, D.C., and while you were there, you could go and talk to the House of Representatives and get them to call you king, right? Like,
well, get them to call me speaker. I mean,
yes,
at least hold a dozen votes or so and then call
yeah,
me speaker. Not
13,
to date our
14.
podcast to when we're recording this, but cool.
It's
Yes, let's move on to the next section.
excellent. So the next section we have is the White Cloak section, right? So our narration comes from Joffrey Bornhald, who is a character that we have seen in a previous book. I think, to me, the most interesting part of this section was putting it in the context of the prologue to this book, right? Because we had gotten this interesting hint that the White Cloaks, who we had previously thought of as a very gray organization, right? They're doing dark seeming things, but in the name of the light. We've now learned that there is at least one dark friend in that organization and that they have plans. And so I kind of spent this chapter, I think the first time I read it, and certainly this time, looking for what clues can I gather as to which one of these characters is Bors, the white cloak dark friend from the prologue chapter. Is that the reaction that you had to the chapter or to this section of the chapter, or were there other things in here that you were kind of pulling out or finding interesting?
I was definitely like, this has to be the guy. Like, this is him, because it was always like he calls himself Bors and he
Yeah.
takes on this false identity. But I certainly agreed with what you said in the synopsis, which eventually I landed on. Okay, so it's not him, but we're getting closer. Um, and interesting to me. I guess I can't say this is the first time for that I should have experienced this, but this was a time where I'm like, oh, I definitely remember talking about Jeff from Barnhold because it was such a funny name,
Yeah.
and like here he is back around in an unexpected way. To have that be in a little vignette moment like this gave it extra kind of interest to me, but I don't know that I ultimately think he's going to be that important a character.
Yeah, well, and this is something Robert Jordan, I think, does really well, is he says, look, I'm going to give you 60 names, and of them, 20 will come back, and of those who come back, 6 will be important, and of those 6, 1 will eventually become a character who you think of as really, really important. And that's, I think, a really effective strategy because it's how the real world works, right? In any given day, we interact with 100 people and we remember 4 of them. I think this is something that is a gift of Robert Jordan's is here's a pile of names. Enough of them will come back that you have to and want to pay attention. This is one of the few series where I actually remember all of the callbacks. Most of the time, I just let that flow over me and don't pay attention to it. Jordan does it well here. A couple of little details in this section. First off, we mentioned this in the summary, but I think the idea that we now know that there are questioners within the White Cloaks, they have the separate crooks on their cloaks. That seems to be our first hint at where we might be looking for the Dark Friend. Any other interesting details for you in the interactions between the characters? I thought it was very interesting to see how Joffrey Bornhold, who in the previous book was kind of the head of the organization of the White Cloaks, we saw in this chapter, we see him kind of interacting with one of the questioners in kind of a way that is kind of very deferential. And then also we get the flashback to his interaction with Pedron Niall. So what was your reading into? Obviously, this is another pile of politics I'm throwing at you, but the little kind of hints of White Cloak politics that we get in this section.
I think again, I was trying to trace. We've had this kind of recounting of how much chaos is being sown, so I was trying to trace. Okay, here we have another set of characters that should be monolithic and all on the same. I mean, they're literally in lockstep, I think, in this chapter, and yet they're not. And so to recognize that this is going to be really, really easy to exploit is kind of the clear message to me. And again, thinking about the prologue, we know somebody is about to exploit it. So it's not like I'm like going out of my way to do some genius interpretation.
I think the only other thing that I had in this section that is, kind of worth noting from my notes is we get a couple of rumors in this chapter. And as we said, I think in the previous chapter, rumors are something that Robert Jordan really loves to play around with, right? And so we hear Joffrey Bornhold is kind of concerned. He's heard rumors of Arthur Hawkwing's armies returning. And then we also get in this chapter descriptions of what are called the Strangers on Toman Head near Falme, and they are described as using Aes Sedai to fight with them, as either being monstrous or having monsters. And so this seems like kind of either a new force or wild rumors. So I was curious what you made of kind of all of these new interesting descriptions that we've gotten of whatever is going on in this area that's now been highlighted 3 or 4 times in this fairly new book.
I bumped a lot on Arthur Darkwing. Dark you just said it, and
Hawkwing.
I already Hawkwing, Darkwing. I was going for Darkwing Duck, Hawkwing, because we talked about him last book, as I recall, and we talked about Arthur. And is this, there's also some kind of bastardization of Pendragon, right, in the mix somewhere. So is this our Arthur? Is it not? It's obviously a name that carries a lot of weight in mythological storytelling. So that's where my interests mainly lie. And then, I mean, I'm reading all these kind of sprinkles as we're going to end up at Toman's Head, and there's going to be some crazy stuff going on. And, this is what you do in Act 1. You point everybody towards where they'll be in Act 3, and then we get to have a lot of fun. And so I'm looking forward to the fun. But I think I am thinking of all of that as the finale of this book, where we'll be in April and May, not where we'll be in February. But I know I said that a lot during Eye of the World, right? Where I'd say like, oh, well, the Fellowship will break up at the end of the book, and they broke out for the, majority of the middle of that book. So we'll see if I'm right or wrong.
Yeah, and this is something that I was actually thinking about the other day. As you were describing in that first book, a lot of times, it feels like we're going to have the breaking of the Fellowship at the end of the book, or we're going to have it now. And it's interesting to think of, how closely those beats kind of matched up between, the Fellowship versus the Eye of the World. But it's also worth noting we're still only 1/5 of 1/3 of the way through, right? So in terms of percentages, book 5 is the end of the Fellowship of the Ring. Wow. So there's some interesting dynamics going on there. Unless you had anything else on this section, Leandrin,
dark friend's gonna dark friend, right?
Yep.
It seemed clear that Moiraine was already suspicious, and then we see her acting on that and working actively to manipulate the situation. And again, I'm gonna just keep saying my soundbite for this: sow chaos and make everything more difficult. Seems to be the goal, and seems like that it was achieved.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a ton to say about this section other than Leandrin is really creepy, and I don't know what she is doing with the one power, but it shouldn't be done. That's kind of my takeaway from this section. The interesting thing here is that we get to see an interrogation sequence where no actual information is passed, right? We don't get to learn what
Mm.
Leandrin is looking for. We don't get to learn what orders she gives or what her objectives are. We don't even explicitly get her saying that she is a dark friend, although I think you're right. That is very obvious very quickly that that's what's going on here.
Mm.
What was your take on? Do you have any impression or thoughts on what you think Leandrin is trying to do, or do you see this as a very kind of open ended? I have no idea, but we'll figure it out in 100 pages kind of mystery.
The only thing that came to mind is that we've had a variety of reasons here to show that the
Agelmar.
Angelmar has been very much in tune with the Aes Sedai, from the ceremony and the hospitality that we talked about last episode, and then the idea of who was giving the orders. Like it could have been any of them,
Yeah.
really, and the horn earlier in these chapters, as you pointed out. So my mind went to that isn't good. If all the people are working directly alongside the Aes Sedai, that's not good for the forces of darkness. So this goal has to be, let's tear them apart. Let's break that up and make sure they're angry at each other and mean to each other. So
Yeah, absolutely.
suspicious of each other.
Well, I actually just finished watching the penultimate episode of the television show Wednesday. It's wonderful. And
I
in
was
that
watching Willow. Dang it.
and in that episode, two friends almost split up, and the person who does it is another character named Yoko, and that just made me smile and makes me kind of think exactly what you're describing. I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
I don't know whether actually you're a Buffy fan or not. This is not a thing that we have discussed at any point.
I watched the other Willow. Come on, Tyler.
Uh, but one of my favorite episodes of that show is called The Yoko Factor, and it is based on exactly what you're describing, right? If there is a tight alliance that seems to be kind of defeating everything you can throw at it, the simplest way to solve that problem is to put something between that alliance. And so thinking of Leandrin as doing that, I think is at least a really good kind of starting place to think of kind of what are her objectives and what is she doing. Separating Amalisa from Agelmar may be a really good first step at breaking up whatever is going on in Faldara that makes it difficult for the darkness to succeed. That kind of seems right on track with what we're thinking there. Um, I have nothing else to say about Leandrin. She creepy. Um, I have nothing at all to say about Padden Fane. Not who I expected is literally the only note I had for that section of the chapter. Any thoughts you had about Padden Fane in prison?
Someone surprising arrives at Padden Fane. So that's all I wrote.
Cool.
So yeah, I still think of him in kind of a Hannibal Lecter way. So who's visiting Hannibal and why? But
Yeah.
I interpret his comment as he knew there was a mole within these structures, and he was not expecting the person who came to be that mole.
Yeah.
Nice little bit, nice little cliffhanger. I don't think it's anything more than that at this particular moment, but I'm excited to see who it was and start to question everybody.
Start to question everybody should be the name of at least one Wheel of Time book. That's all that I have for this chapter, broadly speaking. So I have to say, I'm very excited we are moving forward because we're getting so close to the part of this book that makes me love it instead of the part of this book that makes me say, why, Robert Jordan? Why? How are we back in Rand's head again? Speaking of which, I think we're back in Rand's head again next week. Greg, I'm going to let you kind of take us out of this episode. I just want to say for the viewers, I'm really excited if you've stuck around with us this long. I think we are just about to get through the homework section of the Wheel of Time and into the really, really fun section of the Wheel of Time. So please stick around with us. It's going to get even more exciting, and there are more things coming soon that Greg won't be able to preview for you, but he can at least tell you what's coming next week.
I really thought you were about to just, even though you told me I was closing, you were going to throw it through the glass columns in and not even let me talk. Yes. So agree with Tyler. Thank you for sticking with us. I know we've got some loyal friends. We've had some friends dipping out if our download numbers are anything, but please continue to share and spread the good word. I think a lot of if my social media is very nerdy, so I see a lot of people setting new book reading goals for the year. So if you have a friend who's looking looking for an adventure and wants to come along. Obviously, sometime this year, we're going to see the season 2 of the show, and the excitement's going to build at that moment, and we'll just become podcasting superstars. But in the meantime, next week, please join us for chapter 6 and 7 of book 2, The Great Hunt, of course. Chapter 6, just Dark Prophecy, and chapter 7, Blood Calls Blood. I think it's a little bit longer than average. It's not the worst we've seen, but might take a little more time than average. And we look forward to discussing it with you, adjacent to you, as your dog walks and we travel along with you. However you enjoy us, we'll be there next time through the Glass Columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.